I packed my bags the week after our 45th anniversary. No shouting. No scandal. He was watching TV. I folded my sweaters in the bedroom. People assume divorce at 70 means something dramatic, a betrayal, a secret, a final straw. But it wasn't like that. It was emptiness. Years of polite dinners, short conversations, holidays that felt more like performances than celebrations. There wasn't a single moment of cruelty. Just the quiet ache of being unseen for so long, I stopped looking back. We'd become experts in not disturbing each other. Not asking. Not answering. I knew how he took his coffee, how he liked his socks folded, what shows he'd fall asleep to. But I no longer knew how he felt about me or how I felt about myself when I was near him. I didn't leave because I hated him. I left because I couldn't find myself in the silence anymore. And as strange as it sounds, I wasn't alone. There are more of us than you think. They call it gray divorce. But the truth behind it isn't gray at all. It's sharp, clear, and long overdue. People often assume that long marriages end because something explosive happens, a betrayal, a massive fight, a secret brought into the light. But in reality, what breaks a relationship after 40 or 50 years isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's the quiet erosion of intimacy, the slow settling of two lives into parallel lines that never intersect. There was no single moment when I realized we had drifted apart. It crept in over time, disguised as routine. The same breakfast every morning. The same short conversations about the weather or what was on the news. The same polite goodnights, followed by the sound of the television humming in the next room while I read alone in bed. From the outside, we looked like a couple who had it figured out, stable, dependable, familiar. But inside our house, everything had turned static. In the beginning, we were a team. We built a life, raised children, weathered job losses, illnesses, long nights with crying babies, and the heavy silence of grief. There was always movement, always something to do, to solve, to plan. That momentum held us together more than we realized. But once the noise settled, once retirement took away the urgency and the house emptied out, we found ourselves side by side with nothing left to talk about. He didn't do anything wrong. He was kind, consistent, present in the way he knew how to be. But the years had folded over him. He became quieter, more rooted in his habits, less curious about the world and about me. When we were younger, he used to ask what I was reading, what I thought about something he heard on the radio, what I wanted to do next summer. Somewhere along the way, those questions stopped. I didn't even notice at first. I just kept answering questions no one asked anymore. At first, I tried to fill the silence with little things, new recipes, short day trips, tidying the house even though it didn't need it. But nothing brought back the feeling that we were living a shared life. We had become two people maintaining a system. He took care of the lawn. I made the doctor's appointments. He paid the bills. I sent the birthday cards. Our days functioned perfectly and meant almost nothing. We weren't unhappy, exactly. There were no loud arguments, no insults, no bitterness. Just indifference. He was content to exist beside me, and I was learning to pretend that was enough. But over time, the pretending became harder. I started to miss being seen, not just looked at. I missed the way he used to touch my hand while talking, the way he used to sit and really listen. Now, when I spoke, he nodded without lifting his eyes from the television. I thought maybe it was my fault that I'd become too internal, too private. Maybe I wasn't interesting anymore. But then I had coffee with a friend I hadn't seen in years, and during that conversation, someone looked at me and responded to what I was saying, not just with politeness, but with interest. And it hit me how long it had been since I'd felt that. It wasn't a midlife crisis. I wasn't searching for excitement or reinvention. I just wanted to feel like I still mattered in my own home. Like I still had a voice. Like I hadn't dissolved into the fabric of his routine. There's a danger in believing that peace means happiness. Sometimes peace is just the absence of motion, of challenge, of growth. We had become still, and in that stillness, I realized I wasn't waiting for change. I was waiting to disappear. And once that thought took root, I couldn't unknow it. When you imagine growing old with someone, you picture quiet mornings, shared blankets, laughter over small things. You don't picture the way time can stretch thin between two people until all that's left is proximity. The myth is that aging together means closeness, that the longer you stay, the deeper the bond becomes. But time alone doesn't build connection. Without care, without curiosity, time can become distance in disguise. We thought we were doing everything right. We didn't fight, didn't stray, didn't give each other ultimatums. We took care of the house, kept up the yard, made plans for the holidays. But somewhere along the way, we stopped evolving, individually and as a couple. And that quiet stagnation, masked as stability, began to feel like something else entirely. No one talks about how aging with someone can sometimes mean aging away from them. How you wake up one day and realize that your values have shifted. That the things you used to tolerate now feel unbearable. That your needs have changed, and you've never spoken them out loud, not even to yourself. I began noticing how many decisions I made by default. What we ate, where we went, how we spent weekends, it was all dictated by habit, not preference. I couldn't remember the last time I had chosen something just for myself. Not because he stopped me, but because I stopped asking myself what I wanted. I let the rhythm of we erase the shape of me. There's this cultural narrative that, by 70, you should be grateful. That wanting more emotionally, intellectually, even physically, is indulgent, maybe even selfish. But what happens when the gratitude becomes a muzzle? When I'm lucky to have someone turns into I no longer recognize myself, and I don't know how to say that without hurting him. I thought about intimacy. Not just sex, though that had long ago become routine or absent, depending on the month. I thought about the kind of intimacy where someone notices you've been quiet too long and asks why. The kind where someone remembers your preferences, not because they've memorized them, but because they've been paying attention. When I tried to open that door, softly, gently, it didn't lead anywhere. I once asked if he ever thought about what life might look like if we made changes. A trip. A new hobby. Something different. He looked at me, confused, and said, at our age. As if change had an expiration date. That question haunted me. At our age. As if 70 meant we were already packed away. As if the desire to grow, to shift, to seek out something more meaningful had a cutoff point. I realized I didn't believe that. I wasn't done asking questions. I wasn't done becoming. But in our home, nothing changed. The same TV shows. The same meals. The same short responses to questions that once led to stories. And the more I tried to adapt, the more I felt like I was shrinking to fit a version of myself that no longer existed. What no one tells you is that it's possible to love someone and still feel utterly alone in their presence. That you can be faithful, devoted, and still ache for something they stopped offering long ago without even realizing it. People expect that after decades together, you find a rhythm and settle in. But no one warns you what happens when the rhythm becomes a cage. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted to be seen again. To matter. To feel like I was more than the second half of a history we'd stopped writing. And when I admitted that to myself first, and then out loud, I knew I had stepped over a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It happened at dinner, which felt fitting somehow. Not a special meal, not a confrontation. Just an ordinary plate of meatloaf, potatoes, and peas. We sat at the table like we always did, across from each other, chewing, swallowing, talking, but not really speaking. He was telling me about the neighbors. Something about their son moving back in and parking too close to our driveway. I nodded in the right places. I smiled when I was supposed to, but I wasn't really there. I remember looking at my plate and realizing I'd made this exact meal hundreds of times. The same sides, the same portions, even the same salt shaker between us. It wasn't just food. It was a ritual we had fallen into so completely that even our silence had structure. At one point, I looked up and watched him gesture vaguely with his fork, making a point I no longer remember. I noticed the lines in his face, the way his shoulders slumped slightly more than they used to, how he still wore that old shirt with the missing button near the cuff. And I felt nothing, not anger, not affection. Just distance. That was the moment. It wasn't a blow-up. There was no dramatic realization. It was quiet, almost respectful. It felt like truth arriving in the middle of something ordinary. Later that night, we watched television. He sat in his recliner, I sat in my spot on the couch, and we both stared ahead. The sound was on, the lights were low, but I couldn't focus on the screen. My eyes were on the side of his face, and I found myself thinking, if I left tomorrow, would he notice right away? Or would it take him until breakfast to realize the rhythm had been broken? It wasn't a cruel thought. It wasn't meant with malice. It was honest. I didn't feel missed, and I wasn't sure I had been truly seen in a long time. The next day, I did laundry like always. I folded his t-shirts, sorted socks, wiped down the counter. But something had shifted. Every movement felt like repetition instead of care. The house felt like a space I was managing, not inhabiting. For the first time, I sat down and tried to picture my life 5 years ahead. Would anything be different? Would we still be eating the same food, watching the same shows, saying goodnight with that same practiced tone? I couldn't imagine anything changing unless I changed it. That night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my own reflection and held the stare a little too long. I looked older, yes, but I also looked absent, as if I'd been gently fading from my own life. I didn't make the decision then and there, but something solidified. It wasn't a question anymore. It had become an answer. There's this idea that if you've stayed married for decades, you're supposed to see it through. That you've made it this far, and walking away would be a kind of betrayal not of the other person, but of the commitment itself. I had believed that too, for a long time. But eventually, I stopped asking whether staying was noble. I started asking whether disappearing in place was living. When people talk about leaving marriages late in life, they often want a clean reason. A dramatic exit, a clear villain. But sometimes the hardest departures come without violence, without scandal. Just the slow, steady realization that something essential has gone missing, and it's not coming back. For me, it was my voice, my presence, my sense of aliveness. And when I finally understood that I was the only one who could reclaim those things, the decision didn't feel reckless or cruel. It felt overdue. No one prepares you for the practical side of divorce at this age. The legal process is the same, but the world looks at you differently. People assume that by 70, your life is settled. That if you've made it this far, you'll ride it out no matter what. When you leave, especially as a woman, people don't say it out loud, but you can feel the question behind their eyes. Why now? There's no handbook for how to tell your children. Mine are grown, with families of their own. When I called my son, he thought something had happened to his father. When I told him what I was doing, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "But you guys are okay." I didn't know how to explain that being okay isn't the same as being alive. My daughter was quieter. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She said, "Okay," but I could hear the weight in her voice, the worry that something had broken in the foundation they'd always relied on. And maybe something had. But it wasn't the marriage. It was the illusion that endurance is always virtue. The reactions from friends were mixed. Some were shocked. Others were quietly supportive. A few reached out privately and said, "I've thought about it too," in whispers, like they were confessing something shameful. That's when I realized how many people live in quiet dissatisfaction, held in place by fear, convenience, or habit. Living alone again was strange at first. The silence was different, not heavy like before, but open. I could rearrange the furniture without checking with anyone. I could eat dinner at 4 p.m. or 10. I started going on walks whenever I felt like it, taking detours without texting an update. These may sound like small things, but they were new measures of agency I hadn't realized I'd lost. Emotionally, it wasn't liberation. It wasn't like in the movies. There were nights I sat with a cup of tea and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. The house felt larger, the evenings longer. I missed routine, not him necessarily, but the framework we had built. It takes time to separate comfort from connection. I worried about money, about aging alone, about what would happen if I got sick. These fears are real, but they didn't outweigh the clarity I felt when I opened the curtains in the morning and realized the day was mine again. There were also strange adjustments. I had to relearn how to speak about myself as an individual. After years of saying we, I had to start saying I again and mean it. I had to make decisions without defaulting to someone else's preferences. I had to take responsibility for my loneliness, but also for my contentment. There's a certain freedom in realizing that, after decades of compromise, you are still allowed to want things. Not grand things, just space, stillness, a home that feels like it reflects who you are now, not who you were at 25. People think starting over means dating new friends, a new lifestyle. For me, it meant finally allowing myself to be still and hear my own thoughts again. It meant not apologizing for wanting peace on my terms. And peace, as it turns out, looks a lot like mornings spent reading quietly, evenings cooking what I like, conversations that come from choice, not obligation. Divorce at 70 doesn't mean failure. It means something shifted, and I chose not to ignore it. It means I honored a truth inside me that wouldn't stop asking, is this really how you want to spend the rest of your life? I didn't have all the answers then. I still don't. But I stopped pretending the questions didn't matter. After I left, I thought I would feel like an anomaly, someone who broke the pattern, who stepped away from something most people just endure. But the more I opened up, the more I heard versions of my story echoing back at me. They call it gray divorce. A sterile, sociological term that doesn't come close to describing the inner shift it represents. But it's real. The statistics are clear. The divorce rate among people over 60 has doubled in the last few decades. For many, it's not about crisis, it's about clarity. I started noticing it in conversations. A woman I hadn't spoken to in years reached out and told me she'd left her husband at 68 after 51 years of marriage. Another friend said she hadn't made the move, but she thought about it every time she walked past the guest room she secretly wished she could move into. These aren't stories of rebellion. They're stories of awakening. Quiet, complicated awakenings that don't always lead to divorce, but always begin with a question. Is this who I want to be for the rest of my life? For some, the answer leads to new beginnings inside the same marriage. For others, it means closing a chapter with love, but without regret. What surprised me most was how little we talk about this stage of life as one where agency still matters. People treat older women, especially, as if our lives are now fixed. That we've made our choices, and our only job is to manage them gracefully. But there's nothing graceful about pretending you don't need growth anymore. There's nothing noble in disappearing. I've met people who stayed because it was easier, and people who left and never looked back. I've also met people who stayed and rekindled something that had almost died, but not because they waited long enough. Because they finally told the truth. To themselves first. Then to each other. Telling the truth, especially later in life, feels dangerous. Like it might unravel everything you've spent decades building. But the real danger is in silencing it until you no longer recognize the person you've become. I didn't leave to start over. I left to return to myself. And while the logistics were difficult, the emotions messy, and the uncertainty real, I don't regret that choice. What I regret is how long I waited to ask myself if I was still growing or just surviving quietly. No one tells you that selfhood doesn't expire. That the part of you who still wants connection, discovery, meaning, she doesn't disappear just because the world thinks your story's supposed to be winding down. Gray divorce isn't a trend. It's a symptom of silence, of roles we were told to stay inside, of years spent being responsible instead of being whole. But it's also an opening. If you're someone who's wondering whether it's too late to choose yourself, it's not. It's never too late to ask, what do I want now? Not what you wanted at 30, Or what you promised at 40, but what your life is quietly asking for today? You don't have to leave to answer that question, but you do have to listen. Leaving a marriage after decades doesn't make you fearless. It just means you stopped pretending you couldn't feel the quiet unraveling. It means you chose to tell the truth, even when it didn't come with applause or approval. What I've learned since that decision is that I was never truly alone. The more I spoke honestly, the more faces lit up with recognition. There is a whole generation of us, women and men, who are starting to question the idea that staying silent is a virtue. This story isn't about blame. It's about permission. Permission to reflect, to want, to change even at 70. If something in this resonated with you, if you've asked yourself similar questions or made similar choices, I hope you'll share your thoughts. Not for me. For the others reading silently, wondering if they're the only ones. Have you ever felt the quiet pull toward something more? Have you stayed? Have you left? Or are you still trying to decide? Leave a comment. Start a conversation. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice to make someone else feel seen. Thank you for watching.